This exercise is the prone TVA. TVA is short for transverse abdominis. As we discussed earlier, the transverse abdominis is a key stabilizer in the lumbar spine, and it acts pretty much like a corset. So the real challenge with the transverse abdominis is being able to know whether or not you're activating it properly. So you can practice these exercises in the standing position. You can try and activate it just by sucking your belly button up and in. However, sometimes there are some obvious substitution problems, meaning that you can actually use your internal obliques to try and substitute for the TVA, or the TVA may not be working very well at all. For this reason, this is the reason why we advocate the use of the stabilizer biofeedback cuff. Now, the critical importance of using this thing is it's like a blood pressure cuff, which is an alternative version of this, is that when you put this cuff underneath the belly and then you activate your transverse abdominis, the pressure in the cuff will actually change, as I'm going to show you. So it's a great feedback tool to make sure that you're doing the exercise properly. And once you learn this exercise in the prone position with the stabilizer cuff and you get the feeling of activating your transverse abdominis properly, we can progress to the next exercises. This is something you'll definitely want to get as a stabilizer cuff. It's very worth it so that you can make sure that you're doing the exercises properly. Many times I found that even people who feel that their transverse abdominis is functioning very well, when I put them on the stabilizer cuff, I find indeed that they are underperforming. So setting up the stabilizer cuff is most important, and what I'm going to have Allison do is to put her belly button right on the lower second section of the bladder. Not on the very lower side, but in the middle. If you see that there's two major lines here, she's going to put her belly button on the second of the lower one. Now you want this tube to be in the right position as well. So the best position for the tube is to make sure that obviously it's on the outside of the hand that you're going to be holding it on, and that the tube gets out of your way. Because otherwise it can get a little uncomfortable, or you'll feel that the tube is winding around you when you're performing the drill. So I'm going to have Allison lift up, and she's going to put this, again, her belly button right on the lower portion of the second part of the bladder. And I'm actually going to hold this for her in the beginning, just to make sure, so I can do the instruction. You're going to make sure that you close the nozzle on this, and as she's relaxed, as you can see, she just rests her head down, or her chin can rest on her wrists, whatever's more comfortable. The most important point here is to make sure that the rest of the body is completely relaxed. We don't want to have increased tone anywhere else. This can encourage substitution patterns in the transverse abdominis, which we don't want. So from the relaxed position, just breathing normally, I'm going to pump the cuff up to the red line, which is 70 millimeters mercury. It'll take quite a few pumps to get that up there. And I'm right on the red. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that there will be some back pressure in the tube, which will throw the numbers off a little bit. So what I'm going to ask Allison to do is to just breathe real deeply and then relax. And as we see, the cuff has dropped down to about 62. And the reason why is because the airflow is now going back into the tube. That's completely normal, and then make sure you do this step prior to starting the exercise. So now I'll just pump it right back up into the red zone where it should be, and then we're ready to start our drill. Now, proper activation of the transverse abdominis. The transverse abdominis, if you remember from the anatomy section, goes from the lower part of the pelvic bone all the way up underneath the sternum. Now, its activation is essentially, the fibers run into this direction, for example, is drawing the belly button toward the spine, but not only toward the spine, but slightly up underneath the rib cage. So if you think about a triangle from the ASIS bones to the belly button, you're almost trying to lift the ASIS bones toward the belly button. If you perform this type of motion, the transverse abdominis will activate pretty well. So, how we're going to test this? Very simple. What I'm going to ask Allison to do is just continue to breathe normally, and as she breathes in, I want her to go ahead and exhale, and upon the exhalation, I'm going to ask her to perform that job. So, on exhaling, draw her belly button up and in toward her spine, trying to lift from the ASIS bones. Now, if we look at the cuff, you can't see it from here, but the cuff should decrease between 6 and 8 millimeters Hg. So I can have her relax now. So on the red zone, if the red zone is 70, she should be able to get it down to 64, if not 62. She should be able to reduce the pressure in the cuff by 6 to 8 millimeters Hg. Now this signifies the activation of the transverse abdominis. Two other things that can happen is if the pressure gauge goes up. So if the pressure gauge goes above 70, it means that you're activating the global muscles, the rectus abdominis or the internal obliques. This is a faulty movement pattern, and it does not cause recruitment of the transverse abdominis, but instead causes a faulty problem with co-activating the topical stabilizer muscles, which raises the pressure in the cuff. We do not want this. So we want to make sure that we're lifting the belly button up off of the cuff and up slightly toward the sternum. If you're doing that, the transverse abdominis will fire nicely. We also want to make sure that there's no additional substitutions, lifting your pelvis up. You shouldn't feel tension in your neck. Your body should feel very relaxed, with the exception of lifting that belly button up and in. Now, we want to make sure that you breathe normally throughout the course of this drill. It is common in the beginning, when you're trying to isolate a muscle that may not function very well, particularly if you have back pain, to hold your breath because you're trying to focus. Do your best to avoid this and continue breathing normally throughout the duration of the drill. And yes, when you do breathe normally with your belly button up and in, you will see a little bit of fluctuation in the needle. That's completely fine. The key point is to make sure that you're performing the activation correctly and to a degree that's high enough to be able to maintain the contraction to build endurance in this key spinal stabilizer. Now, the drill is going to be performed for 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off for 10 repetitions. So for Allison to do this on her own, I'm going to hand this dial right to her. And the best way to do it in terms of positioning, she can hold it over like that. Some people like to rest their head on their chin or turn their head sideways. It's all good. And she can readjust the needle as she needs to. So to perform the drill, as she breathes in, she'll fully exhale, drawing the belly button up and in toward the spine with no substitution. She's reduced the pressure in the cuff by about 6 to 8 millimeters. She will continue to breathe normally and perform the drill holding it for 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, she can go ahead and relax, and then she just breathes normally for 10 seconds again. After 10 seconds, she'll take her breath. Good. Upon exhalation, she'll draw that belly button up and in toward her spine and hold for another 10 seconds. So this is repeated for 10 repetitions, at which time you can take a rest, and if necessary and the program warrants, you can do an additional set of a full 10 repetitions. So after performing this, you'll be able to activate the transverse abdominis properly, and then you're ready for the next exercise.